everybody. Welcome to the County Seat. I'm your host, Chad Booth. Today we are looking at one of the new pieces of legislation that's just coming online here in the state of Utah. It's House Bill 163 as it was debated in the legislature, and it changes the categorizations of personal use of public property. And it was a clarification on a bill that some people are quite concerned about the impacts it will have on appointed, hired, and elected county officials in the execution of their daily concerns. Exactly how does it work? Well, that's where Derek Dowsett starts with a little bit of background.
The line between our personal lives and work lives is often blurred. We've all taken work home before and had to deal with some personal issue from work. That line has also become somewhat more blurry when it comes to what would be considered personal use of something we use at work, digital devices in particular. Have you ever checked your social profile on your company computer? These blurred lines can be problematic in state and local governments because officials and employees who work in this sector are typically using equipment and tools that were purchased with public monies. Now, the laws governing the misuse of public money are pretty straightforward, but a recent audit found that the definition of using public property for private use was clear as mud, prompting the creation of House Bill 163, which goes into effect in a few weeks. The law makes any personal use of public property a felony, and the convicted person would be disqualified from ever holding public office again. The issue for some public officials is that while the new law makes things more clear, they think it has gone too far. There's concern for those whose job is to serve the public that if they are targeted or make a mistake, that they could lose a lot more than their job. Consider these scenarios. Running an errand in a county vehicle while you're in Salt Lake for the legislature, before driving home to Vernal, Milford, or Blanding. Writing an email on a county device, using a county-provided gym, or using a county pen to sign a personal check. Well, one would assume that common sense would prevail, but what if someone had a professional or political grudge to settle and used this law to attack their opponents? What would you do? Well, these are all questions to be answered in our discussion. For the County Seat, I'm Derek Dowsett.
Good question, Derek. So what would you do? Well, we will talk to the author of the bill and a representative of one of Utah's most concerned groups, the sheriffs, when we return here on the County Seat.
All local products have a story of magical places, real people, and delicious recipes spanning generations. So go ahead and discover flavors you've never tasted and friends you never knew you had. Utah's own Discover Local Food.
There's a little place on a Utah map where I was raised, where my heart's at, where the sagebrush grows wild and high, and the stars come out at night. Oh, there ain't nothing like being raised in the basin with a Ute reservation, skiing starvation, that Duchesne, 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 Duchesne,
Welcome back to the county seat. We are talking about House Bill 163, one of the new pieces of legislation that is coming online right now in the state of Utah. And we've now had a chance to kind of look at a couple of case scenarios of what the dilemmas are and what the bill was about. It's time to delve into the issue. Joining us for our conversation, the author of the bill, Representative Craig Hall from District 33. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And Scott Burns, who is the Executive Director of the Utah Sheriff's Association and has served time as county attorney before. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Chad.
I want to start this conversation your direction and try and get a background on this bill and why you felt it needed to be written.
Sure. So the origin of this bill it comes from an audit that was done by the Office of the State Auditor back in January of 2017. John Dougal, our state auditor, he and his staff performed this audit. And a few pages from that audit showed how literally thousands of dollars of public money was used to purchase public property, and that public property was used almost exclusively for personal purposes. And this was an audit that was done with Unified Fire Authority. Let me just give you, just for context purposes, what the audit found. The following was purchased with government funds and used almost exclusively for personal purposes. 2 27-inch iMacs, a MacBook Pro, a cellular iPad Pro, an iPad 2, a Nikon D80 DSLR camera, an Apple Watch, 2 iPhones, 2 more iMacs, a MacBook Pro, another cellular iPad Pro, an iPad Mini, an iPad 2, a GoPro camera, a Nikon 7100 DSLR, 7 DSLR lenses, a Nikon D80 DSLR, a Canon video camera, and a stainless steel Apple Watch. All of these things cost about $25,000 and were used almost exclusively for personal purposes. So that was the problem that the audit found. And one of the recommendations of the audit was to address this legislatively, and so thus began HB 163. After an evaluation of the facts, this was actually turned over to the prosecutors. And they found that these facts regarding misuse of public property, it was difficult to prosecute. The definition of misuse of public property was pretty vague, and the prosecutors just decided not to prosecute because of that. The misuse of public money is very clear in the statute. It's very clear that you shouldn't misspend public money, but the law with respect to misuse or using public property for personal use, that was very vague. And because of that, the prosecutors decided not to prosecute.
So how did you go about constructing the bill?
Yeah. So we received a lot of input. Obviously, this was of high interest of the governor's office. The executive branch has thousands, literally thousands of employees. So we received a lot of input from the governor's office, from the agencies throughout the state, and also the Utah Association of Counties. The league was very helpful. So we went through several versions of the bill. I think we ended up with 3 substitutes, I believe, or it looks like we ended up passing the second substitute. So I really appreciate the good input that we had from the executive branch, from UAC, and also the League of Cities and Towns.
Okay, so one quick question, and we're going to broaden this conversation out. What was your intent of the legislation?
Yeah, so the intent was to avoid what we found in the audit. Gross abuse of using government property for personal use. All of these things that I just mentioned, $25,000 worth of Apple products and cameras and Apple computers, they were used almost exclusively for personal use. They were taken home, they were used for family and personal use.
In the one paragraph summary of the bill, if somebody looks at it and runs across the gambit, it just doesn't seem to clearly delineate that gross negligence, and it I mean, I have heard conversations since this bill came up of people literally saying, if I sign a personal check with a county pen, am I guilty of a felony? And I think this is some of the concerns the sheriffs have. Is this not correct?
That's it, yeah, exactly right.
What are some of the other concerns that obviously you've come up with some, but there's still some lingering concerns, and I'd like to take some time to try and help people understand where that line is drawn, because it doesn't seem practical that you can go to jail for taking a pen home by accident.
That's right. And we wanted to, that was part of the good process that we had during the legislative process, is that we wanted to make sure that we avoided the situation that we found in the Unified Fire Authority audit, as found by Auditor Dougal. But we did not want to be too draconian in this regard. We didn't want to make anybody a felon by taking a pen home from work. This is basically what we found. We made the general rule that you should not use government property for personal use. However, there are two very large exceptions in the bill. So number one, and two ways to avoid prosecution. Number one is that the entity, the governmental organization, can craft a policy that specifically allows individuals to use government property for personal use. So if the government entity wants to do this, they can basically write a policy that eats the general rule. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if a police organization says that you can take home the patrol car, if it's in the policy, that's perfectly fine. So again, if the organization wants to put together a policy that says you can do X, Y, and Z, and you can use A, B, and C for personal use, the employees of that organization can go ahead and do that.
Isn't there some concern, though, that in saying that you can exempt it with policy, that people are going to have a learning curve along the way, and that they'll say, oh gosh, we never thought about this, now we've got to prosecute somebody, or somebody's brought some charges up, but we need to come up with a policy. There may be some things along the line, because we picked for our story just 3 scenarios. What would you do? Is this against the law or not? And there are probably thousands of them that haven't even been thought of. Sure. What are the mechanisms? So first of all, this bill goes into effect in July. It's not in, usually most of the bills that are passed during the legislative session go into effect in I think it's May 15th or 45 days after the legislative session. The great thing is that the Utah Association of Counties, also Ron Gordon from the executive branch from the governor's office, they are already in process of putting together these kind of policies. So if there is a governmental organization out there that would like some assistance with respect to the policy, they can reach out to those organizations and make the policy as broad as that governmental organization would like to make it. So you can basically override the general rule that is found in statute by putting together a broad policy. So that's the first way to avoid prosecution. The second one? The second one is, regardless of the policy, any type of minimal, incidental, or infrequent use of public property for a personal matter is not against the law. So the policy that allows the officer to take the car home on weekends, right, because the sheriff's department wants the visibility and they want a guy, if he needs to be on call, to have a patrol car. If he stops by to pick up laundry on his way back to work, that's incidental. That's correct. That's correct. And do you think anybody would not see that as incidental at any given time? No, I don't believe so. And number one, you can make the policy as broad as the governmental organization wants to make the policy. So certainly the policy can cover incidental use already. But just as a backstop and to make sure that this rule is not draconian, we have specifically put in the bill that any type of minimal, incidental, or infrequent use of the public property for a personal matter is not against the law. Okay, we're going to take a quick break here. We'll come back with more of the county seat in just a minute, and we'll pick up this conversation.
All the traveling that I've done over the world, I'd still rate this locale as being one of the best.
This is some of the most scenic country out there. And part of the appeal for Kanab is it's a small town. It's beautiful. People are very friendly.
It's just been awe-inspiring.
You just couldn't find a nicer place to come.
Mountains to explore. Adventure to be had. A town to fall in love with. Yes, all that in Park City, Utah. Start your adventure at visitparkcity.com.
Welcome back to the County Seat. We're talking about House Bill 163, which is a Public Accountability Act of some, I guess would be the best way to describe it, about the use of government property for personal use. One of the concerns that I think is a significant concern in this case is weaponizing this bill. And I think you're from Iron County, so what's going to happen in a situation where you've written a policy, it hasn't covered every nut and bolt because you haven't thought of it, and you've got one elected official who does not like another elected official, and they start just harassing them over this law, charging them, if in nothing else, in the public court of opinion, with a felony. I mean, do you see this as a concern?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank Representative Hall. I think his intent is good, and I also would think there would have been some struggles in crafting the language because I've been a prosecutor for over 20 years. For 5 years, I had the honor to serve as the director of the National District Attorneys Association in Washington, D.C., and screening is something we train on a lot. You made a pretty good opening statement for a felony case. That much evidence, that much personal use, no one wants to second guess the prosecutor in that case, but that's pretty compelling, and I can see why you would want to address that. On the other hand, and you brought up rural America, I have 29 sheriffs I work for. The majority of them are in rural jurisdictions, and I had a sheriff call me on my way up here, and he said, hey Burns, I think I just committed 3 felonies if this was July 2nd. I said, Sheriff, what did you do? I hauled a prisoner to the jail about 58 miles away. I stopped and got some eyeglasses for an elderly woman in my county. I picked up a prescription for my wife, and then I threw in 2 bags of grain for my horses. And so I said, well, let's look at each one of those. Taking the prisoner clearly, is part of the job as a sheriff, and he's got to drive home. Constituent services, I guess, for an elderly woman, I don't know. I wouldn't charge him for helping an elderly person. Picking up a prescription, I think, is incidental, and I think now when he stops and gets 2 bags of grain, most sheriffs in rural Utah have horses or cows or animals, and I certainly wouldn't charge him, but they're concerned about that. These are the things that they raise. I don't think there is any sheriff in the state of Utah that doesn't know what improper use of government property means. I really don't. I think they know.
Let's look at a couple scenarios here. All right, let's take Beaver County. The sheriff's department has a gym for the deputies to work out on their off time. They can come in, they can bring family members in, and they can use this gym equipment. Are we in gray area there?
So the best thing to do is to make sure that the policy is written in a way that specifically allows what you just described. Go ahead and put in the policy that this gym is available not only for employees but also for employees' families. Go ahead and put that in the policy so it's very clear that that type of personal use of public property is allowed.
Are you concerned that there actually could be some political mischief caused with this?
I mean, Iron County, they just went through a couple of years of the county attorney, no longer in office, trying his best to have the Iron County sheriff arrested for something. And weaponizing is a good word. So that would be one concern, but I think Representative Hall makes an excellent point. We just met in Manti. We had all the sheriffs there and the jail commanders, and that's what we came up with. We're going to write a comprehensive policy and maybe tweak it a little bit for some of the rural sheriffs and county officials and others that face things that those living on the Wasatch Front would have no idea about.
Well, you take Kane County. Yeah. If you've got a commissioner that's coming up here to a UAC meeting or to address a legislative committee, they usually are up here on Thursdays. He takes a county car, drives from Kanab to here, and while he's here and he's taking care of his business at the Capitol, before he goes home, they don't have a Costco in Kanab, so he might stop at Costco and throw a few things in the trunk. Sure. Could somebody make a case out of that?
Well, again, the best way to avoid this situation is to write a very broad policy. If the legislative body of that area wants to put together a very broad policy that allows personal use of public property, then it's always going to be allowed. And frankly, the Unified Fire Authority, for example, could have written a policy that allows all of this stuff to happen. So again, make sure that the policy is written in a way that that the legislative body of that geographic location wants the public property to be used. If they want the mayor or the sheriff to use the public property and it's allowable 24/7 for whatever personal use, they can write a policy that communicates that.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll come back with our last parts of this discussion on House Bill 163 right here on the county seat.
All local products have a story of magical places, real people, and delicious recipes spanning generations. So go ahead and discover flavors you've never tasted and friends you never knew you had. Utah's own Discover Local Food.
I promised my son that if he got straight A's, the two of us would take a guys trip. We were riding on the Lincoln Loop Trail outside Minersville, Utah. There was so much to explore, and the trail just kept climbing higher, right to the very top of a mountain called Jack's Peak. We just stood for a while, taking in the whole world below. On the way back to camp, my son turned to me and said, "I love you, Dad." Then suddenly it hit me. This wasn't just another camping trip.
Welcome back to the county seat, talking about House Bill 163 today. We've gone down, I think we've allayed a lot of fears of elected local officials in the counties around Utah, just based on what Representative Hall has told us here. But there is an area still that's legitimately of concern, and that is that even if you know you can't win a prosecution because it falls within a policy or it falls within incidental use under this bill, somebody could still make a claim, and the news media picks up on somebody filing a complaint about a violation of the law, and now you've got an image problem on your hand that may be undeserved.
Well, certainly that's the case with any kind of criminal law. One thing that I want to make clear is that, again, the county, the city, the governmental entity can make a policy that is broad as they want it to be. And also to repeat this, that any kind of minimal, incidental, or infrequent use of the public property for a personal matter will not be against the law. When we saw this audit, we wanted to make sure that we communicated to public officials that they need to be cautious with respect to this issue. But we do not want to be draconian with respect to this issue as well. So we want to remind governmental officials they need to be cautious. They can't purchase $25,000 worth of toys to take home and use exclusively for personal use. But we don't want to be draconian in this regard, so that's why we're allowing these governmental entities to craft a policy as they see fit, which is best for their organization and for their entity, and again, reminding people that infrequent incidental use is not against the law.
Okay, so Scott, a question for you. As we go into this, there are most likely going to be some situations that come up that a policy may have been written for that they don't cover. It's amazingly how innovative people can get about applying a law. Yeah. Are you prepared or concerned as a group to try and communicate some of those areas that may need clarification?
Yeah, and we may have to learn as we go, hopefully not in a negative fashion. And there's an old saying that bad facts make bad law. What you told me, if I had a sheriff that was taking IMAXs and iPhones and multiple phones and cameras and all of those things that weren't used on the job, would have a problem before House Bill 163. But I think you said allayed, that's a good word. I think you've allayed our fears about a lot of that. But as you say, the policy, I think, is in place as a backstop, and your words are soothing.
And one thing that I want to make clear as well, we worked a lot with UAC, we worked a lot with the League, we worked a lot with Ron Gordon of the executive branch to make sure that the wording of this bill was correct. But I have committed to all of those organizations that if we need to tinker with the language or change the language of HB 163, either during the interim or during the next session, I am committed to working with them to make sure we got it right.
Excellent. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for inviting us into your home. Remember that local government is where your life happens. Be involved, be part of the solution. Share this on social media and share your comments. We'll see you next week on The County Seat.